You know, as the Bush administration begins its last lap with its budget for 2009, you look through it, I did, for some acknowledgement somewhere of the mistakes and miscalculations that have left us with a mountain of debt. Some evidence of lessons learned. But today's budget, once you look through it, bears all the hallmarks of the Bush fiscal legacy. More deficits, more tax cuts, offset to some extent, partially, by draconian cuts in Medicare and Medicaid, and smaller but significant cuts in a whole array of different accounts, adding up to $144 billion over 5 years in non-defense discretionary spending. President Bush took office, as Senator Conrad reminded us, with an advantage that no president in modern history has ever enjoyed: a budget in surplus. Big-time surplus, $236 billion in the year 2000. His economists looked out over 10 years and they saw nothing but surpluses coming up, nothing but roses. And so they estimated the cumulative surpluses would total over 10 years $5.6 trillion. We were wary of that. I was wary of it. Others of us involved in the process were. And we warned the president not to bet the budget. After all we had done to put it into balance over a 15-year period of time, not to bet the budget on a blue sky forecast. He turned our advice down and instead effectively told the American people we could have it all: guns, butter, and tax cuts too, and never mind the deficits. The Bush program passed, and by the year 2004, in 4 short years, the surplus was gone, vanished, replaced by a deficit of $413 billion, in nominal terms the largest deficit in American history, from a $236 billion surplus to a $413 billion deficit in 5 fiscal years. For fiscal year 2009, next year, the administration projects a deficit of $407 billion, very near the record level in 2004. But in calculating this deficit, the administration has inserted a $70 billion plug. It's a big plug for the cost of our deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan. We don't get a real number. They acknowledge that this number doesn't bear any relationship to any likely cost. It's simply a placeholder until they can make up their mind what to come ask for. The administration also assumed that the alternative minimum tax will be fully operative after 2008, reclaiming with one hand tax cuts extended on the other hand. If realistic adjustments are made for our deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan, and if the AMT is adjusted so that it doesn't apply to middle-income taxpayers for whom it was never meant in the first place, by our calculation, the deficit for next year is at least $440 billion. And just to show you that we didn't come up with this number by snatching it out of the air or pulling it off the seat of our pants, this is a little linear chart here that shows the path that the president would have you believe his budget is taking. But in truth, when we adjust for the supplemental to fund the war effort in Afghanistan and Iraq, and when we adjust for the alternative minimum tax, that is, we assume, which I think is the only politically viable assumption, that it will not be applied to anyone other than the 5% of all taxpayers in the upper brackets who pay it now. This is what happens. Instead of following this path to balance in 2012, which the president touted the other night, it takes the lower road, and in 2012 there's still a deficit of $233 billion. And since we haven't included every other assumption we might have to worsen that deficit, that's just a result of 2 major changes in the underlying assumptions that I think are politically realistic. We're not reaching to make this particular point. Ever since this administration turned record surpluses into record deficits, they've assured us that there's good news just around the corner. Good news just around the corner. Well, we've turned the corner, and we found out the news is not so good at all. As we look back, as the administration must, as we look back over the last 6 years, we find that this administration has racked up 5 of the biggest deficits in American history. 5 of the biggest deficits have occurred on their watch under their policies. When the president took office, just to repeat these numbers again, the debt numbers, total statutory debt numbers. When the president took office, we got a little bit different display of it. This is, when I go back to my district and speak to civic clubs, Rotary clubs, Lions clubs, This chart here, which is basically the back of an envelope, is probably the one that attracts more attention than anybody else. When you tell them that when President Bush came to office, we had a statutory debt of $5.7 trillion on the books, and then when he leaves office, it'll be more like $9.7 trillion, nearly $4 trillion in additional debt over 8 years, they're incredulous. Simply cannot take in that this has happened, but it has happened. As Yogi Berra said, you can look it up. It's a matter of record, unfortunately. So, what does the administration propose in this budget? Granted, we've got a tough problem on his hands. Senator Conrad will acknowledge that. I'll acknowledge that. So what do they propose? Senator Conrad ticked off some of their proposals. They want to cut Medicare by $566 billion over 10 years. They want to cut Medicaid by a smaller amount, but still a sizable amount, $47 billion. They want to cut NDD, non-defense discretionary spending by $144 billion. They want to impose $86 billion in new user fees, no new taxes, but $86 billion in user fees. They want to wipe out the Social Services Block Grant, which is a multiplicity of different programs that does lots of good locally. They want to cut LIHEAP by $570 billion at a time when fuel prices are soaring and the existing program only reaches 18%, 16% of those who are qualified. They want to cut EPA by $330 million for 2009. The Centers for Disease Control, why them? $433 million. At the same time, they want to refuse to send us one of the key elements of the budget that we have to consider, and that is the supplemental cost of deploying troops in Iraq and Afghanistan over the next calendar year. They've also refused to submit to us what they say is their permanent fix to the AMT. Mr. Rangel, as chairman of Ways and Means, has developed one that would be offered on the House side or the Senate side if it were ever put in play. But we have not received, even though we have had 3 different witnesses tell us that they can fix the AMT, they can fix it within the context of the tax code, they can fix it on a revenue-neutral basis, but they won't send us a fix. They won't send us a fix to negotiate. So faced with huge deficits and mounting debt, the year after I came here, the year before I came here, President Reagan said, let's go back and do a mid-course correction. And he did so by signing TEFRA in 1982, and then Graham-Rudman-Hollings in 1985. The first President Bush agreed to a budget summit, a costly summit, because he eventually agreed to a tax increase that a lot of people saw as contrary to his commitments at the nomination. President Clinton made deficit reduction a priority. He put on our doorstep on February 17th, right after he was elected, is the first really substantial official act, a balanced budget, an agreement that would cut the deficit by more than half over a 5-year period of time. And then when we had basically completed the job, he came back and negotiated and forced through the so-called Balanced Budget Act of 1997. What has President Bush done? Far from proposing to fix the budget, the Bush administration is proposing policies that will worsen it, leaving the consequences for the next administration.